Hey folks, I hope that wherever you are in the world today, you're doing as well as you can in your given circumstances. I've just finished a workout and I had some thoughts that I think might be worth sharing as they may hold some value to you, because they certainly have for me. I'm 32 now, or I will be this August, which means that although I'm no longer part of what we generally consider to be the youth, I'm still relatively young. It was around the late end of 2015 when I first began to notice the beginnings of the cultural shift that we're all currently living through. I began to notice a particular kind of ideology seeping into the mainstream consciousness when words such as white privilege and toxic masculinity began to make their way into popular discourse. And so, when I realized that I did not agree with these sentiments, I began to seek people out who shared my objection. And given the benefit of social media, I quickly found people who felt similarly to the way I did. Now, finding communities such as this was a very comforting feeling because it felt like you could finally express how you felt without people looking at you sideways or assuming that you were some sort of bigot for wanting to express your own thoughts. But over the years, I've come to realize the downside of seeking out such communities. Because when you enter a community in which most people think as you do, you run the risk of ironically sacrificing your individuality in another way. Because humans, by our very nature, are tribal beings. We tend to like to go with what the rest of the group thinks. And there's evolutionary reasons for this. Because in the past, those who didn't abide by group norms were generally left out in the cold to die. But in the modern world, where thankfully for most of us, the safety of our lives is fairly reasonably stable, although in South Africa that's not really as true as it currently is in the West. But even here, I can be fairly certain that I'm not going to be murdered immediately at the drop of a hat. However, that tribal instinct remains deeply ingrained within us, and over the years, I've come to realize just how dangerous that can be in daily life if you're not consciously aware of it and managing that impulse. In 2016 and onwards, I began to see people who disagreed with me or even identified differently from me in the political sense, not as individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. I began to see them as a monolithic and homogeneous enemy. So I thought that based on how someone identified socially, I didn't have to know them to know what their opinions would be. And I'm sad to say that to an extent that is true. If somebody is loudly political in the way that they express themselves to others, you can generally predict what their views will be. But that is not always the case, and that's why it's dangerous to see people in terms of their group identity and not simply as individuals. It's ironic because the very first reason that I started to seek out a community of like-minded people was that I began to get tired of having views and actions ascribed to me simply on the basis that I'm a white male. And yet, after enough time, I began to fall into the same trap. And as I say, that to a large degree is inevitable if you're a normal human being, because it's very difficult when you're around a group of people who confirm your biases to take a step back and think to yourself, hang on, is what we're saying actually correct? Or do we just think that because everyone around us believes it to be correct? So the point I'm trying to make here is that in recent months, I've come to the conclusion that aside from a few fundamental things, like the existence and reality of biological norms in men and women, as well as the assumption of collective guilt or victimhood based on race, gender, or any other immutable characteristic, there are very few things that I have the willingness or energy to argue with people over anymore. I simply do not want to be in the mindset of constantly engaging in conflict and trying to one-up my ideological opponent. Because, yes, you can do that all day, every day. In fact, that is basically Twitter's entire business model at this point. But at the end of the day, you realize that even when you win, what if you really won when you engage in arguments like that? You either manage to make someone feel inferior, or you silence them completely by making them feel so stupid and insignificant that they no longer wish to speak. And I came to realize that if I truly value the principle of free speech, which I do, then I must be willing to listen to and engage politely with people whose opinions and views I might not believe. So I guess it might seem contrived or overly simplistic to say this, but unless it's really necessary, don't waste your time on anger at someone online, and particularly not on people in your own real life, because you can feel righteously angry all you want, but if that's all you do, you'll find pretty quickly that you'll end up alone and miserable. For now, farewell.